Hey there friends, welcome back to UChed Studio. My name is still Robbie, and today I want to take a 2D cartoon character and bring him to life as a 3D sculpt. So today we're making a slightly more detailed version of Mojo Jojo from the Powerpuff Girls. Nowadays as a girl dad, I've definitely come to appreciate just how cool the Powerpuff Girls really are. But I was just a kid when the original series was on, and back then I was a little boy who thought girls were gross and I couldn't quite relate to the girls themselves. But the villains on the other hand, yeah. Those guys were dope. Some of my favorites were the Gangrene Gang, and Rowdy Rough Boys, and Fuzzy Lumpkins, and him, who was especially weird and amazing, and of course, Mojo Jojo. They're all awesome, and honestly any of them would be fun to sculpt, but Mojo just kinda called to me for some reason, and I really like saying Mojo Jojo, so Mojo it is. As always, I started the sculpt with an armature wire skeleton with a thick gauge wire for stability because even though I'll try to minimize the weight of the head by bulking it with aluminum foil, Mojo has a big ol' head and brain, so the wire will have to be able to support all the weight. So I mold the foil into the rough shape and size of the head and brain hat thing, and then cover it in a thin layer of clay and then bake it. Once it's cooled and hardened, I sketch out my plan for the face and then start carving into it with my X-Acto blade to create the openings for the eyes and the mouth. I know most people would probably skip baking this early and just map out everything while the clay is still raw and malleable, and I do that from time to time as well. But most of the time I prefer having a solid base to build off of because when I'm adding new elements to the sculpt like this glob for Mojo's mouth and jaw, if the base is hard then I can get a bit more heavy-handed while attaching and blending new pieces. So as I start building up the features of Mojo's face, which at the moment kinda looks like General Grievous, I'm aiming for a more detailed version of the original cartoon design. Not quite hyper-realistic, but something that fits more within my skill set. And since he's such a simple 2D character, I have to make some decisions about how I think Mojo would actually look in a 3D world, which is mostly just grumpy. First step is to mold the shape into a cross between that of an actual chimpanzee and the simplified and stylized version of Mojo's face. In the cartoon, his teeth are usually illustrated as simple little triangles, and obviously I want to be more realistic, so I'll style the mouth to look closer to an actual chimpanzee mouth brandishing its teeth. To make the teeth, I roll out some flat strips of clay and then layer them until I have the right thickness, and then cut out a few circles. Then I cut some smaller circles inside of those circles and then slice them in half, and just like that, I've got the base for a set of teeth. When possible, I like making the teeth all connected together this way like a single denture piece instead of building each tooth individually. It makes them much easier to apply to the mouth and it helps keep everything nice and uniform. So I cut some grooves into the half circles to imply individual teeth and then attach some fangs and then throw them into the oven to bake so that they get nice and hard, which as I said makes shoving them into the mouth much easier. With the teeth in place, I add some lips and filler as needed so that the mouth blends into the face smoothly and doesn't just feel like a hole with some teeth in it. From there, I continue adding detail to the face, trying to make it feel believable and intentional as a 3D character, while still making sure it clearly reads as Mojo. To do that, I stick closely to the original cartoon design wherever I can, and I think one of the most important features that defines any character is the eyes. Mojo's eyes are large and slanted, so I kept that overall shape, but I added more wrinkles and folds and an expressive brow to push the intensity and amplify that constant anger in his expression. Another element that helps the 3D version maintain a similar silhouette to the 2D version is the ears. And even though I'm attempting to make the ears look more believable like a real monkey's ears, I tried to maintain the same overall size and rounded shape. I then threw it in the oven to bake to lock in the progress and then got started on the brain hat thing. I attached it by drilling a hole into the bottom of the hat and the top of the head and then connected the two with a piece of armature wire. Once attached, I wrap a few layers of clay that I rolled flat with my pasta maker, finishing with a top layer of a firmer clay. It's the same clay that I used for the more detailed parts of the face because it's not as soft or gummy as the white clay, so it holds a flatter, smoother shape, which is exactly what I want for this hat. After blending it all together into a rounded shape, I throw it in the oven to bake until it's hard, and then I use a few different grits of sandpaper until the surface is nice and smooth and clean and molded into a somewhat consistent dome shape. After that, I throw in a fresh layer of clay around the face as a base to build up his hair. While the firmer clay made it easier to achieve a flat, smooth surface, the softer, gummier clay is much easier to poke and scratch and pull into a texture that reads as hair. The firmer clay could work for this too, especially if I was aiming for a more precise, realistic fur detail, but it would just take a lot more patience. With the face mostly done, I'm ready to move on to the hands, which I make by squishing a ball into the rough shape of a mitten. I then cut some lines where I want it to bend and then fold it into the shape of a fist. I add a thumb and then press out some of the curves so it's not so round and doesn't look as much like a Mickey hand. Which was unsuccessful. It still totally looks like a Mickey hand, but oh well. I then bend the arm slightly to make room for the hands and wrap the armature wire inside of the hands onto the main armature wire skeleton, which I don't recommend. It was pretty difficult to wrap the wire around without messing up the hands, and in the end it held just as well as it would have if I'd simply attached the hands directly onto the end of the skeleton, which is what I normally do. But I wanted to try something new, and I did, and I hated it. At least now I know one method I don't want to use for attaching hands, and it might work for some people, but my fat fingers definitely rode the struggle bus on this one. Anyway, I added a fresh layer of clay to the arms, just like I did with the face, and then scratched in some texture to imply hair. Next, I rolled out a flat strip of clay and cut it into a vest pattern and blended it into his body. I then pressed in a groove to create a place for his belt to sit, and then scored in some folds and wrinkles with a ball stylus, and then used a bigger ball stylus dipped in rubbing alcohol to smooth out any frayed edges. I pulled at the bottom of the outfit to try to get it to flare out more instead of hugging his legs, and then attached a strip for the belt with some bacon bond, which is like a polymer clay glue. After that, I rolled another strip of clay flat and rounded one end to a point and cut a neck hole to make his cape. I then added some simple folds to it. Again, nothing too realistic, just enough so that it wasn't a flat shape. Then I finished up the sculpt by adding the little design element and the jewels to his hat, and with that the sculpt process is done and we are ready to paint. Or at least that's what I thought. I realized after applying the gray base coat that I never added the end of his gloves, so the hairy arms just kinda ended at the hands. Thought about leaving it, but it was too obvious to get away with being lazy, so off screen I wrapped a piece of armature wire around the arm and then used some UV resin to blend them together. I usually use my airbrush for the base coat and then I hand paint everything else from there, but on this project I wanted to try to use the airbrush more intentionally where it made sense. So in this case I used it to create a soft ring of red around Mojo's eyes because in a lot of the original illustrations his eyes have that pinkish tone. I didn't want to make them literally pink in 3D, but that detail made me think he'd naturally have a more red tint instead, like his constant rage is just permanently leaving a red ring around his eyes. After that I did some dry brushing on the fur to break up the flat color a bit and give it some variation, implying different colored hairs here and there. You know, typically you'd use a little round brush that's intended for dry brushing, but I found that I have better results using this flatter brush as I can get it to glide across the top layer better without getting into any of the grooves, just leaving paint on the highest point. I'm sure the intended brush probably works better for most people, and my struggles with it are probably just user error, but the flat brush works for me, so that's all that matters. And honestly, I actually use the round brush for blending, which I will share shortly. Anywho, I added some grime to the teeth and then started applying a dark green base layer for the face. I'm using acrylic paint on this project, and I personally find it easier to work from dark to light in most cases when I'm painting skin. While the dark green base coat was drying, I went ahead and added the iris to the eye and then dotted in a black pupil using a ball stylus dipped in paint. Then once the base coat was dry, I started brushing in the first layer of a lighter green. I applied this layer kind of broad, and I do so with one of the handful of different blending methods that I use by dabbing at the edges when the paint on the brush becomes thin, allowing me to create a bit of a feathered edge. Then on the next layer, I'll apply a lighter shade of green a little tighter using a different blending method where I apply a wet line of paint and then I dab it with the round brush from before, pulling the paint toward the edges as it thins to create a gradient finish. Once that's done, I brush some gloss varnish into the mouth and onto the eyes to create a bit of shine to imply moisture. I typically use a UV resin for this step, but the gloss of the resin can be a bit much and the varnish is easier to control. After that, I do my best to find a steady hand and brush the purple line design onto his hat, which is just far easier said than done. In the cartoon, the band around the hat is gray, but I imagine it's actually made out of metal, so I paint it with a metallic steel paint and then I paint the jewels with the same purple as the lines. Next, I apply a blue base coat to his outfit and then use the same purple from the hat on the underside of the cape while the outer layer matches the blue from the suit, and then I hit his new boot goofing boots and his gloves and his belt with a slightly glossy white. I break the airbrush out one more time to add some depth to the folds and then quickly remember between the lack of precision on the airbrush and slightly crooked line work on the hat that I don't have a steady hand. Which is exactly why I usually don't use it for anything beyond laying down flat base colors. Anyway, with that, Mojo Jojo is done and ready to be assembled and spin around in dramatic circles. Well, I sure do hope you enjoyed this little project of Mojo Jojo. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already to see what we make next. If there are any fellow donut holes out there or members of the Princess Posse, you know, Parade of Horribles comes out soon, so I don't know about you, but I think it's a perfect time to sculpt Carl and Donut. If you don't know what that is, I'm sure you're like, what the f? Anyway, that about does it for Mojo Jojo, so I appreciate your time, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.